Thank you, everyone, for joining the Winning the War Against Implicit Bias program. Here today, we have Judge Holly Fujie, who has been on the bench at LA Superior Court since 2011. And she has sat on the family law bench as well as she's at civil now. And Judge Rupert Byrdsong, who was appointed in 2014. And are you still the president of the okay, he's the
immediate past president.
Immediate past president of the Cal Judges Association. And he's at civil, complex, civil.
Civil, IC assignment.
And we have Mia Yamamoto, who used to be a DA beating public defender, but now she is a criminal defense lawyer, still fantabulous. And we have Dr. Gitu Bhatia, who is a forensic psychologist who works a lot with the families and doing evaluations of psychoevaluations of the children and the families. So we have, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are here because you love to learn about implicit biases, not because you need the credit for MCLE. So with that excitement, I would like to toss the mic to Dr. Gitu, who's going to go over the basic concepts of what implicit bias is and what it isn't. Take it away.
Thank you, Jinna. And actually, I wouldn't consider myself a forensic psychologist. I do work with family law situations and help parents with co-parenting issues and so forth. And I do some work with cross-cultural clients and so forth. But in any case, I think the word implicit bias is thrown around and is not always understood. I think it's often confused with overt bias, explicit bias, or discrimination. And implicit bias is actually different. It doesn't mean even fair-minded, good people, objective people like us have implicit biases. We do have certain shortcuts our brain takes because we're bombarded with thousands of bits of information all the time. And so from a neuropsychological point of view, our brain does need to sort of collapse things and make quick decisions and judgments and not take every bit of information in all the time. So our implicit biases are often unconscious to us. These are the shortcuts that our brain makes based on lifetime of experiences and information that we've been given. So it will implicitly sort of sort things out and take shortcuts. So what happens with implicit biases is that when you're under stress or when you have a time pressure, those implicit shortcuts will happen more often. And especially if you have less information provided to us or a situation is kind of ambiguous, we're not familiar with it, those implicit biases will enter and will determine how we decide that. So some of it is protective and some of it is just a efficient way that our brain works. So, and also the good question is, do these trainings in implicit bias help us? I would say that it kind of helps us only if we're aware that we need to make some changes, not always. And do you all remember that there was a incident at Starbucks that they closed down all Starbucks for one day to give them an education on racism, stereotypes, implicit bias, or whatever? Well, one day of doing that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something that along the way helps us be less biased. I think it doesn't just help for us to think, oh, we're good people, we're not going to act in discriminatory ways. And often even with our implicit biases, we tend to not act in discriminatory ways overtly and consciously. So what's important is to help to change these implicit biases that happen is really to make that process of thinking a little bit more involved in terms of having checklists, for example, so that you know that you're slowing down that shortcut process and making it a longer process of decision making. So also becoming familiar with groups of people that you're unfamiliar with is a way of overcoming implicit biases. So if I've never spent time with a transgender person, I'm going to likely have implicit biases about that. But if I start to spend time and get to know people, those implicit biases go down, the shortcuts become less apparent to us. So it's really important to recognize where you might have lack of experiences and try to be more clear about the type 2 thinking, not the type 1 thinking that's quick and fast that we need in emergencies and urgent situations, but in decision-making processes involving more information allows us to not go to that implicit bias place. So later, maybe we'll also talk more about some really concrete ways of avoiding acting on implicit biases. And I know that our panel members will speak to the ways that they bring in objective ways to change this tendency that we all have, 100% of us have, to have implicit biases. One thing I'll mention about the implicit association test that people often use, I don't think it's a great tool. It just validates that we all have implicit biases, but it also makes people very defensive and think about, well, that's not how I act or whatever. What is important about these tests is it as a population information, it allows us to see what kinds of biases we all tend to have and how to counteract them. And something I shared with these panel members recently is that many of the biases, that discriminatory kinds of things that are helped by education like this, has still been not effective with certain groups of people. So I think we're all becoming much more aware of racial discrimination, and we're making some changes in that direction. We are, but the populations that tend to still be very much discriminated against are people with disabilities, people with ageism. Ageism is one of those things that hasn't changed in this culture as much. And also body size. That's one of the things that's the last ones to be moved in the direction of having openness and not having automatic reactions and discriminatory behavior. And lastly, I think recognizing our implicit biases is important, because when we don't, that's when we make microaggressions. Like, these are things that come out that we don't intend to hurt someone, but will come out. So I'll hand it over.
I just wanted to jump in. Thank you. You said a really, really good point about the fact that when we don't hang out with people who look different than us, who act different than us, to eliminate this mystique, this mystery, because when we do have those interactions, we tend to find that we have much more in common than we have different. And if you look at the history of this country in terms of how you had the schools segregated, you had the neighborhoods segregated, and you had restrictive covenants to enforce that segregation. So when you keep communities separate and they don't get the chance to live together, well, yeah, you're going to have a bunch of people not knowing who is what, and it's hard to break down those barriers. So, where the law comes in terms of desegregation in education, desegregation in our neighborhoods, that's a good place where it should start, but we find ourselves still working on that. But yeah, I love to go hang out at my other bar association groups and multicultural bar association. When you get to go to these other organizations and hang out with them, it just becomes so normal. And that's really the goal, right? To normalize that, hey, yeah, we're all different, but so what? So what? It's nothing to be scared about. And guess what? I'm going to learn a lot from Holly, and she's going to learn some stuff from me. We're gonna trade recipes and stuff. So
Well, yes, we do trade recipes. He has the best recipes. I wanted to mention something, which is that what exactly coming off of what Judge Byrdsong was talking about, which is that I grew up in a primarily Black neighborhood in Oakland, in West Oakland. And when I was growing up, there were like a couple of other Asians in my class, but it was mostly African American. And we had one white girl in my first grade class, and she was unfortunately very neglected. And she was of all the kids in the class, she was the one who came in dirty. She was the one that came in sort of beat up. And so the impression we all of us had, was white kids and white parents don't know how to treat their children well, and they're not clean, and they don't, they don't do their schoolwork. And so it's what you experience. So that was our all experience. And we used to, well, my Black friends and my other two Asian friends, we would all, go, oh gosh, isn't too bad that white people don't take care of their kids. And it wasn't until I went into a more white neighborhood, or I went to a white school for like 3 years in elementary school, that I realized that, oh no, that was just my experience at the time. And it doesn't mean that's the way everybody is. So it was a very early lesson in how to deal with your own implicit biases about races.
So the more I learn about implicit bias, it feels to me like it's much like language. So I majored in linguistics, and linguists say, if you don't get exposed to a certain sound by the age of 13, 14, puberty, then you can't really acquire that sound, you can't assimilate it, because you already have your A through Z. And when you hear a different sound, you try to match it with the sound system that you have in your brain already. So for example, Koreans have the sound, it's not R, it's not L, but whenever Koreans see R, they make that sound. When they see L, they make the same sound, because that's in their dictionary in their brain. So implicit bias feels like when you see somebody, oh, I know somebody who sort of looked like him or sounded like him, then he must be like that person.
Mhm.
Welcome back, Mia.
Or someone who looks like Mia.
Okay, so let's actually talk about how to get people acknowledge their implicit biases without making them defensive, or even how to make ourselves recognize our own implicit biases. Do you want to go first, Mia, since you're back in the room?
I heard a lot of stuff that I agree with. Let me just say that in terms of, I don't know if there's anybody who's the expert on unconscious bias. One of the hardest things to identify, but I'm going to just say this. I think one has to acknowledge some of the things that we're saying about in terms of having enough visibility as whatever kind of minority you are. I am an Asian American, transgender woman, Japanese American, and that gives me an experience with respect to different kinds of bias and different kinds of decision-making that is done just based upon my status, whatever the heck I am. So it is a way of experiencing being on a webinar, just talking about my perspective and doing at least this little much to normalize transgender, Asian American transgender lawyers. There aren't a whole lot of them. Interestingly enough, when I came out, I was the first one, but the next one out was the Asian American DA. I thought that was interesting. But in any event, so we are working and producing in various aspects of the industry and the profession, and that serves as an example of what we can do. it was a little like coming out in the legal profession as an Asian American lawyer back in the 70s, 60s. And the notion that you have to get here, not many of you here, you're gonna have to do a really good job. You're gonna have to make sure that you're worthy of your intrusion into this particular club. So that would serve to be a mission, and it would provide you with the reason to keep going and hopefully at least survive, hopefully thrive. All those sorts of things serve as a model to other people to let them know that it's okay. But the other part of it is, again, it puts me in contact with other people, for better or for worse. I'm as human as anybody else with every other shortcoming and vice in the spectrum. And that I have in common with everybody. You know, I am a criminal defense attorney, and I was born in a camp. I guess a lot of people know that about me. I was born in a World War II concentration camp for Japanese Americans. I know something about people saying we don't like those people. You know? And so taking it all the way into my status as a transgender woman, operating from that perspective of bias or expectation or stereotype, whatever it is I'm coping with, I present in an honest way of another person. And I think you're right. All the people that I spoke about, just give me one person from that particular community or whatever, for better or for worse, they could be a real jerk, but they'll serve to share their humanity. And no matter what, every individual, no matter, you don't have to be somebody from my minority group, has had their own unique individual history with all the forces that we talked about. The professor talked about, doctor. All of those factors and all those elements are working upon us in various angles and perspectives, and from places of perspective. Being a minority, being a person that's a particularly targeted minority. And I say this as a transgender woman. Black transgender women are the most targeted people on this planet. And that's not happening just in LA, it's all over the world. So that particular form of violent bigotry is something that has to be countered by some level of humanity. Whatever you got, you know, I have to be as, in my place, I have to be as open and notorious as possible in order to have as much effect with respect to what it is I'm trying to do with. So let me just say that, yeah, proximity, curiosity, a legitimate curiosity about people around you. Learn about the food, talk to them about their, what they do when they go to church. You know, everybody's different, but everybody's similar, you know, Rupert's talking about, realizing how much we have in common, exchanging recipes and that type of thing. And that happens, and it doesn't happen without proximity, some measure of proximity. Okay, let me jump off
intentionality. and intentionality. And that's a very, very powerful word you use, me, normalize. The people who are kind of nervous about these types of conversations when we're talking about addressing and dealing with these biases. I mean, that is just a small microcosm of the big game of diversity and inclusivity, right? And what people, I think, who are struggling with this notion of diversity and inclusivity, they're struggling with this notion that it's about minorities replacing those in the majority. And nothing could be further from the truth. The whole idea of being inclusive is bringing more voices to the table, not eliminating those who are already there. I absolutely want the old guard who've been around, who've had all the secrets. I want them to stay in the room when I come in the room, because I want to learn some of those secrets. But guess what? They also can learn from me. They can learn from my perspective and from my deal. So when we're talking about breaking down these biases, the big game is we want to normalize. Everybody in this room has something to add, no matter where you come from, period.
I absolutely agree, as always with anything that Judge Byrdsong says. And Mia, I know, I've known for such a long time, and I admire so much. I wanted to bring up something that I saw in the New York Times yesterday, an article called "What If Diversity Trainings Do More Harm Than Good?" And what it talks about is that there are times when you talk about diversity, you talk about implicit bias, people get more set in their ways, and they say they get very defensive, and they feel like I'm being attacked, I'm being called a racist, and it makes them more sure that they are the victims here, and that they shouldn't be listening to whatever is being said. And I always try to talk to people about implicit bias in a context that is not racial or gender or anything. I use the example of, okay, you're on a jury, you see a witness come up, and it's an important witness, and that witness looked exactly like your third grade teacher. And in one instance, you loved your third grade teacher. You believed anything she said. What a wonderful person. Oh my goodness. She must be really wonderful. I believe everything she says. The other alternative being you hated your third grade teacher, and you have an automatic, just a visceral reaction to her. This person is horrible and probably lies and cheats and steals. So it's not just that you have a reaction relating to somebody's race or anything. I mean, I found myself in a situation where there was somebody who was very rich and famous. And because of that, it was difficult to believe that this person who was so rich and famous could have done terrible things. And you have to sit back and go, no, if I look at all the evidence, what does it say about this? And yes, this person did do this. In that case, they had admitted to something very big. But it was different. I had to fight myself from my perception of, no, this is somebody I've known for many, many years. I think, has not shown themselves to be this terrible person. And so you kind of try to, it takes a long time to get back to the actual facts to look at them without that inherent bias. So I think there's so many things that can bias you that it's not just a question of saying, okay, you look at somebody and you look at their race or you look at their gender or whatever, you look at their other factors. It's that you have to pretty much examine everything that you do and the reaction you have to everybody. I mean, I was telling my husband, I said, there was somebody I knew in high school who wore this, who I really didn't like, and who wore this aftershave. And I tell you, I smell that aftershave and it's still around after 40 some odd years, and it makes me gag. But I can't think this person is a bad person, just like that person was 45, 50 years ago. I have to get past that. But those types of reactions are very, very hard to get around.
I think that when we're talking about implicit bias, it doesn't come down to anything that's in your head. It's a feeling that goes into the decision making, whatever choice that's happening. And it's hard to articulate. It really is, because you're right, it's based upon a lifetime of experiences, some good, some bad, and like that aftershave. Person's got an awful taste, but they may be a perfectly good person.
Right. When you talk about lifetime of experiences, the way to look at yourself and be more objective is to collect your own data. How many times have I made a decision in this direction versus in that direction? Keeping track of yourself and becoming more objective about your decision making can be really helpful. I wanted to go back to that defensiveness about, diversity trainings and so forth. People are generally uncomfortable about looking at some of the inequities that we all participate in some ways, advertently or inadvertently. We've all been exposed to some of the same media and same kinds of messages, stereotypes, and so forth. So there is a sense of defensiveness, but I think one of the ways that you all are providing examples of your own life experiences, you're making the invisible visible to the people who may not ever experience those things. So when you make that, those personal stories, I feel always have the best outcomes, is that then it helps people understand why that's troubling. And what Mia said, about this, the sense of defensiveness also, that we're hesitant to bring up the things that we're experiencing because no one else will understand. But if they don't understand, they continue to do what they do. So I think it's really important for us to be more vocal and express what's going on. And sometimes it can be in the form of a joke, not sarcasm, but joke, or lightening the experience, saying, I know you didn't mean it that way, but what I'm hearing is whatever. And so that people can start to see what it is that they may be stepping on someone's toes inadvertently, not meaning to. So the intention is not the only thing, it's the impact it has on someone that we need to be aware of.
You know what I think is interesting is that this profession lends itself so much to playing on other people's implicit biases. You think about it, you go to trial, you go in front of a judge, and you're thinking, okay, this person likes puppies and kittens. So I'm going to flash a little picture of a puppy or a kitten. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to show my adorable puppy before I put on the PowerPoint for the opening statement. Or you put a puppy in the opening statement, which I think would probably be some kind of reversible error. But I mean, I think that is sort of what we're trying to train. We're trained to do. Is it for example, okay. So when I was on the family law bench, there weren't very many Asian American lawyers in family law, and what I found is that after I'd been on the bench for a while, more and more Asian American lawyers were appearing in my court. I called myself the Equal Employment Act for Asian American women family law lawyers. And some of them are just marvelous, as can be seen from the fact that Jinna is here. But that I did feel a little bit like somebody's playing on me. Somebody is saying, oh, Holly, Judge Fujie will be much more receptive to an Asian woman judge. And I always say, listen, okay, if I'm doing something for Asian American women and their employment, that's wonderful. And I'm telling you that on the other hand, you better, if you are in what I see in civil, is that they'll bring just an Asian American woman to just sit there at the table, and then she won't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to hold that against her, but I am kind of holding it against the whoever's in charge of that team to think, gee, I have to import some Asian American because I think that she's going to be biased in favor of Asian American women. And I find that insulting.
I got one a little step better than that, Judge Jay. So same thing happened to me when I was in Department 15 in the complex asbestos. And I started noticing, okay, more Black attorneys popping in, because this, the asbestos group is a real niche. So these are the same people. And so I wanted to check, make sure I wasn't being paranoid. So I asked the JA, who had been in that department a very, very long time. I just asked him, hey man, have you ever seen this many Black attorneys in this department? And he was like, you know what? Now that you mention it, I haven't. And I said, wow. And there was a time where this guy, he was a frequent flyer. He was in there, 2 or 3 times a week, because that's what they do. And he's arguing the same types of motions. And this guy brought in his Black senior associate, and he introduced himself. He said, and now I'm going to have such and such. He's going to be doing the argument. And he stepped back, and then it was kind of like, here's the show. And right, he was like, hi, and he just smiling. He's like smiling and nodding. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, he thinks very little of me that I'm going to somehow give this guy more credence just because he was Black versus listening to the arguments and following the law. But as you said, though, it was good, though, that he got a chance to appear. And so, okay, I'm not going to shut this down. But at the same time, I thought, wow, okay, I'm getting gamed here. Mm-hmm. So they're thinking that there's some type of built-in bias if you have the same race arguing the case to the same race as the judge. And we all know that is not how we should operate. We shouldn't even be thinking about that.
You know,
So
I'm
I
not
have-
operating those kinds of quarters, you know, but I could sort of see, like, you know, you're in those big old firms, and they got some brothers now that are working there, and then, you know, I got this motion. Let me check out this judge. Oh, the judge is a brother. Let's understand. Let's Joe down there. You know, I hear what you're saying, though. It's a little bit of pandering going on, but at the same time, it benefits the brothers. So it's like, I know what you're saying. You know.
Yep.
So I have something to add to that. So my husband is an executive at ExxonMobil, and he gets, so the executives toss the management track employees who are Asian to him, have him interview because he's an Asian brother. And my husband says, I am actually stricter on the Asian kids because I want them to be good, to be seated high, because otherwise what we have worked so hard to build will be nothing. It will be like, I'm here, so I can pull you up, even if you're subpar. So he doesn't want that. So it's actually counteractive sometimes. So you don't want to do that.
It
There's a
just
good,
shows you the and I was just to say the detriment of automatic decision making. Just that the hold it moment is really good thing to have for anybody, judges and anybody else alike.
you know what I thought about is this inclusiveness issue that recently there was a movie award show where the presenter talked about how he was asked to speak because it's known to be not inclusive and he's Black and that's why he's there and so forth. So I think there are advantages to inclusivity, as Mia, you said, that having someone else on the judiciary who looks like you, who has the same experiences, similar experiences, is helpful. But sometimes that gets discounted as being just for the sake of appearance and not for true inclusivity, which is having a seat at the table and being also viewed in the same light as the mainstream white population and so forth. There was a question that was asked about what if you were to make an inadvertent goof and say something inappropriate, like a microaggression and so forth, how should you ask? I think the most simple way is to acknowledge that you goofed, that you're human and you have implicit biases that you're sometimes not aware of. And just say to the person who's saying, ouch, you say, I'm sorry. I get it. Like I'm going to try to understand that better or whatever. So just acknowledging and saying, and this may be, you know, because I'm talking to a group of attorneys and judges, saying I'm sorry may also have other implications, like I am at fault or I've done something that is, risk management perspective. But often just a simple, I'm sorry, oops, I didn't know, that hurt, is it's going to take away the major reaction if you don't acknowledge it.
Right.
And
I was going to say, it also can start a discussion. And you can say, I spoke inadvertently, or I didn't realize. Can you tell me how that affected you? Find out why. Don't just say, oh, okay, I'm sorry. And then, you say, I won't do that specific thing again, because you won't understand why, in a more general sense, that particular thing was hurtful.
Very true story. I'm up in the Bay Area doing training. I think it was in my NJO, and I bump into Justice Kruger. Now we have mutual friends, so when she got appointed, I got appointed. We made those connections. Like, hey, okay, we have these common friendships. And so when I bumped into her at the thing, hey, how's it going? Met in the hallway, and she was with this short Latin guy. I didn't say anything to him. I just talked to him like, hey, how's it going? Blah, blah, blah. I just didn't say anything. I saw him there, but I didn't know him. I didn't say, excuse me, who are you? I just talked to her because I knew her. Man, I'm very, very excited about that. But of course, the person who was walking with her was none other than Justice Cuellar, the Supreme Court Justice. And I learned that. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. Did I really just blow off a Supreme Court Justice? Didn't say anything to him at all. And so when he came to Los Angeles, maybe several months later, I went up to him and said, hey, I just want to let you know, I bumped into you and I met you with Justice Kruger, and I completely did not acknowledge it. I just want to say, I'm so sorry. And he was a really good sport. He laughed. Oh, look, that happens all the time. I mean, nobody thinks I'm a Supreme Court Justice. But I thought it was important that I said, hey, I just didn't blow. I didn't mean to blow you off. I didn't know who you were, and I should have just asked. And so that goes to the point of when we're talking about these issues and recognizing our different biases in terms of who lawyers look like, who judges look like. We need to be a little more open-ended about, well, excuse me, I don't know you. Who are you, or what role are you playing in this event? Because I get all the time, you're a judge? I mean, really? I mean, they get this twisted, contorted look. If you tell them I'm a judge, we've had them look at the name tag that says honorable, and like, yeah, so what do you do? You see that? Yeah, I see that. So what do you do? And then you kind of look at them again, and then they're like, oh, Your Honor. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. That happens all the time with me, all the time.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Oh, what I get, because as a woman, there is sort of an expectation that as a woman who doesn't look like she's 22, you get the, so are you still in practice? And I say, no. And they, sort of feel like, okay, now I'm going to ignore her. And I go, no, they make you stop practicing when you go on the bench. And that always shocks them. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. So because there's just the expectation that even if you're a lawyer as a woman, you stop practicing after a few years.
All these things that we're talking about do have to be dealt with by some measure of conversation and proximity. But I also believe, because there's such a measure of insecurity in every establishment, institution, infrastructure, that there's people like me out in the streets got to protest. We got to make people uncomfortable sometimes in order to affect change. And I hate to say it, but I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But it's not for you to do that, but it's certainly for me. So all I'm just saying is that, sure, judges, be civil, and I want you to be kind too. Don't forget that, But let me just say this: a lot of things that we have to deal with have to be confronted. And we're talking about things that are affecting people's lives, and people have to address, what decisions have I made? What choices have I made? What language have I used that reflects the kinds of biases that we're not even aware of, that we're not even consciously aware of, but we are making decisions, we're making choices, and we just have to, I just think we have to keep examining it. And I think the activists and the protesters like us have to keep screwing them in protest in public.
See, I absolutely, and heaven knows I would never, ever try to silence Mia Yamamoto, ever. I'm so glad she doesn't appear in my court, because I just could never get her to stop talking. But I do think that if it is perceived as an attack, what you're going to get is people are going to withdraw from dealing with people at all who are not exactly like them. And that's what I'm always afraid of, is that you're going to say, listen, I'm worried about, oh, gee, every time I say something, these women, they're always complaining about the way that you talk about them. So I'm just not going to talk to them at all. So that's kind of you want to try to keep things on a level where you keep up the dialogue with people, so people will hear. I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing. I think that making people aware of their biases without making them feel like they should be, that they're, oh, walking on tenterhooks all the time. That to say, hey, listen, you can talk to me. You can talk to Judge Byrdsong, you can talk to Jinna, you can talk to Mia, you can talk to Dr. Gitu. And we're not going to say, you're wrong, we hate you. We're going to say, hey, let's talk about our lives. I always think that, when I think one of the things that I tell everybody, I'm basically an introvert. I don't, I'm happy as a clam, just in my chambers, reading a book. But when I go to an event, I want to search out those people that are not talking to other people who don't look like they belong, and to sit there and go, hi, I'm Holly Fujie, who are you? What do you do? And I love, love, love learning things about people that make me think. It's just like Judge Byrdsong was saying, that make me think, oh yeah, I have that in common with you. Maybe it's that I have my colleague across the hall is a white male, and he and I swear we have the same son. We have never seen them in the same room together, because they react the exact same way to everything. They do things the same way. They're basically the same age. And we're always going, oh my gosh, we have the same son. And that's the kind of thing that you learn from getting to know other people well. Find out what their lives are like.
Awesome. So I'm part of a mommy's group, old Korean mommy's group with young babies. That's particularly the name of the group.
Oh, okay.
So all the moms are from 38 to 46, and the babies are anywhere from 2 months to a year old.
Ooh.
And there is another woman who just turned 46, who had a baby when she was 24, just like I did. And then her last one is 1 year old. Mine is 6 months old. And she is very different than I am, although she's Korean, very different walks of life. But I swear we have the same kid.
Yeah.
The first one, the oldest one, the 21-year-olds, she has a son, I have a daughter, but they are the same kid.
Yeah.
So I hear you. So techniques, let's talk about techniques for recognizing our own biases, what we have recognized and how we overcame them, or we are trying to overcome them. Do you want to start, Dr. Gitu?
Well, actually, I wanted to go back a little bit to the implicit bias versus explicit discriminatory practices that Mia talked about protesting against. I think that's an important part that we all in powerful positions need to advocate for the changes that need to happen in our system, and to be allies, to be supporters of people who are targeted is also one of our responsibilities that we shouldn't dismiss, because without those protests, without the allies, supporters being in the protests, like we saw at the George Floyd thing, we had a cross-sectional population showing up for that. That's really more powerful than one group protesting for their own rights. I think that's an important thing I wanted to bring in. But in terms of the shortcuts that our brain takes, I think going back to checklists, having things that we do normally for every case or a situation, or allows us to not take the shortcuts that we might take otherwise. And keeping track of our data, as I mentioned earlier, is really important. Am I making these decisions constantly? And is there something that I need to talk to someone about? I know in our profession, we have consultation on a regular basis. So having study groups and things like that is a way of bringing in other thoughts, and having a study group that is more diverse would also be helpful to not just agree with everybody who's part of your group, but to confront some of these things that may come up and talk about what impact they may have on you and so forth. So
let me just add to that it's impossible to ignore the consequences of both implicit and explicit bias, which have contributed to things like mass incarceration of Black and Brown people, overrepresentation in oppressed places and marginalized communities. The effects of it are very vivid and apparent extraordinarily unequal. And I think if you focus on that and think about how these decisions get made on an everyday basis that led to this consequence, I think at that point is the time for all of us to look inside and say, how much of our decision-making and our choices has contributed to that situation. I know that everybody wants to wash their hands of it, but I think go ahead, but ask yourself that question anyway.
Yeah, these are the things that lead up to the inequities in our system at large. So we have implicit biases at the individual level, but we also have these implicit biases in our systemic problems that we have. So today we've talked more about the individual responsibility, but I think there's a huge implicit bias in the laws and, you know, the inequities in incarceration or education. These are examples of how these individual things become systemic problems, and we need to counteract both of those.
The judges on this panel can actually testify to the lack of women and diversity on the bench prior to their getting on. They are all pioneers, and they shouldn't be this many years after Brown versus the Board of Education. My two cents.
One thing I wanted to talk about was one of the things that as judges, Judge Byrdsong and I know see all the time, which is we see lawyers bullying each other, bullying witnesses, bullying, you know, and whether some of them are related to gender or to race or to other things, but you see that all the time, and it's one of those things where you know, and bullying is kind of, there are lawyers who I swear became lawyers because they were such bullies, and they enjoy it. They don't see anything wrong with it, and it is besides it is up to us
Prosecutors.
Now, Mia. Where we see that, you know, I'm sitting in civil court and I see this all the time. I see, you know, people bullying all sorts of people. And then honestly, if you want to talk about implicit bias, that's my biggest implicit bias. I hate bullies.
I'm
And
explicit on that one.
I think that most juries do as well. But certainly you see that where you see, you know, for example, the younger woman attorney and the older male attorney. And he's like, you know, yeah, oh, you don't, you know, basically saying, oh, you don't have to listen to her because she doesn't know what she's talking about. And you go outside of the fact it's a bad idea to do that in front of a woman judge, but you see that, and they honestly think this is the best way to be a lawyer. And this is how you represent your client properly. And the fact is, it's not. It's a bad thing to do. I see all the time juries reacting really badly to bullying. And yet it's something that honestly, I don't think any class or any millions of classes is going to keep the people who bully people from doing that. But yeah, but it does occur a lot, especially, as I said, the dynamic is generally male bullying woman, but I've seen women bullying all sorts of other people. So.
Yeah, I think when you talked about attorneys being bullies, I think when we talk about stereotypes, that's what it is when you have a lot of information with one group and your exposure to that group it then leads to a stereotype. And I think it's at the next level. It's not implicit, it's more explicit belief about a group. And we need to also unpack that. That's easier to address because we're aware of it. I'm aware of how I felt about my French neighbor who was rude. You know, we shared that experience.
I have a lovely French neighbor.
Right. So I am explicitly aware of it. So when I have a family that's French, I am aware that I need to not take that road and be clear about understanding them. Okay. So I think that those are a little bit easier. And the other thing I think you said has more to do with incivility that's been talked about a lot in terms of more recent experiences in many forums. I think that's a different thing where you know, we need to be more aware of how we impact other people.
Oh, yeah, and the bias certainly, I think, increases some of that incivility because they come at someone not respecting them in the same manner as someone else. So that bias then has a very negative impact with how we conduct business on a day-to-day basis. So we have to elevate that type of conscience. We need to elevate civility just in a vacuum. That this is a profession and we should be acting a certain way. And in doing that, we kind of through the back door try to address some of these biases that we need to be checking.
So I wish we can go on forever, but because we only have about 10 minutes left, I want to move on to addressing judges' implicit biases as to the types of cases, plaintiff versus defendant, area of law. Who wants to touch on this? Judge Fujie?
I think it is definitely clear that all judges have certain prejudices, whether it's against a type of case or plaintiff or defendant or something like that, or sorry, I've got an ambulance coming down the street. And it's I think for lawyers, you have to recognize that people do have those biases, and you have to deal with those. It's you're not going to be able to say, Your Honor, you're biased against plaintiffs. That's not going to be good. And what you need to do is obviously to show on a case-by-case basis, a situation in which perhaps they put that thumb, the metaphorical thumb on the scale on the other side. And it's an interesting thing. I get all the time. You get when somebody's picking a jury and they say, well, okay, if the evidence came out absolutely 50-50, and this is a civil case, what do you do? And getting people to say, well, if the if plaintiff hasn't shown their case by the preponderance of the evidence, then defendant wins out of that situation. It's a hard concept to think about. It's 50-50. Why can't I just say, well, I like this person better, or I want this person to win? Instead, you have to say that's the way it's going to be. And so I think that especially for the trier of fact, whoever that has to be, to make it clear that if this is the legal way that you weigh these out, and this is what you have to do under that circumstance. But it's hard. It's hard. I want to hear what Judge Byrdsong has to say about that.
Well, I think some people may try to say that I have a bias against the plaintiffs in these lemon law cases. And the perspective I share with them is, this lemon law statute deals with you dealing with your car, but it's not a class action statute. It's not a product liability statute. And so when I force them and get them to focus on what the statute is really about, something I get a little pushback, like, this is not, you're not letting me try my case. No, I'm not letting you try the case you want to try, but I'm gonna let you try your case. The plaintiffs who actually come in here and focus on what happened with this car, they do great. And I will support them every time if they try that case. But am I going to let them just do whatever and get all this class action discovery and cars down in Detroit, whether they're breaking or not? Absolutely not. I'm very, very transparent about that. But one might conclude that I have a bias against them in that regard. I probably have a bias against people who want to augment their cases, whoever they are. And I'll say it to the defense as well. If they try to turn their case into something that it's not, I'm going to let them have it. I'm going to have it on my wall. Try the case you have, not the one you wish you had. If you do that, you'll be fine. So, I don't know. I haven't been papered too much yet.
I also say you do need to listen to what the judge is saying. Listen to what the judge's concerns are. And when the judge has ruled, the judge has ruled. And it's one of the most difficult things that I find as a judge is dealing with rudeness from attorneys. And I think that that's increased as we have all these remote appearances. You can't look and see you know, you can, but it's not the same thing to look at the judge and think, oh, I better stop talking about this. Or to say, you know, I'll go, excuse me, counsel, excuse me, counsel, excuse me. If I have to say, excuse me, counsel, 3 times, the first couple of times, I'm kind of going to assume you didn't hear. But after that, and if I get a what, you know, what do you want to say? And I'm going, you know, I think you need to calm down. You need to think about where you are. You are in a court of law. You are not just talking to somebody in your living room, even though you may be, you know, Zooming from your living room. So
listen, getting back to the subject of implicit bias.
Oh gosh.
Listen, and what the question, and I hate to jam you up, my good friend, but listen, what she's asking, and let me, if I can address it, I think that unconscious bias, what is called implicit bias, it can't be addressed just by individual decisions and details. And everybody is a little bit insecure. Anybody who's being attacked is going to respond by a counterattack. It is just natural. It's human nature. I agree with all the things that are said about dialogue. I agree with all the things about being inclusive, because I think all of those things contribute to the defeat of bias at every level. And it's always going to exist to some extent. It is our demon, our devil, that's going to have to be fought against generations from here. And I think that all of us just talking about it, talking about how we do some self-examination and some self-criticism can help in this process. And I direct this not just to the judges, I'm always jamming you guys up. I direct it to all of us bar leaders and all of us who are trying to be a good and positive part of this profession, that implicit bias does exist. It has consequences. You can see them vivid as they come. And we have to take a look at them and take a hard look at ourselves. And I think at our practices, our language, how we treat people, how we include people, how we exclude people, and why, and start thinking about how these decisions affect people on a wholesale basis. So that's my only contribution to it. I'm not in your jobs, senor and senorita judges, but just from the streets, being a private old solo practitioner from the minority communities, plural, I'm advocating for them always. And I think that these things affect them greatly, profoundly, and life-changing ways.
That's a big, big, big statement, man, when you talked about people being excluded and why. We know it's about fear. It's about being scared of being replaced. And as I said, when I've been having this dialogue, I absolutely try to tether it to, no, inclusivity does not mean replacing you, my old white friend. That's not what that means. I'm not coming to take over and move you out and put you in the retirement home. I want you to be right there in the room where you've been. And you're going to put me beside you. And guess what? I'm going to give you some nuggets that you didn't ever think about, and vice versa. And now we have a better product across the board because now we're sharing ideas. That's what inclusivity is all about. It's not replacing anybody. But we want more people in the room. Our former Chief Justice, Tanakati Asaki, she said it very, very clear to me. The only time you do not want more voices in the room is because your own voice is insecure.
Nobody's going to sell this bar association, the Beverly Hills Bar Association, on any kind of replacement theory. So, I don't think we got to worry about these brothers and sisters in this bar association looking at their history. So I think they recognize what's going on. And
a last comment. I'm looking at the questions and answers. I'm sorry, there's some really good questions that I'm looking at. I'm looking at one from Sally Weaver about that teachers have to change the way that they perceive things and what they do before they call out somebody who is a person of color, a kid of color. Would you do the same thing to a white kid? I think that applies both ways and for everybody. That you think, would I do this? I used to do that when I was in family law, when I would say, okay, so I'm making this order to the wife. Would I make this order to the husband? And the question about bullying, a lot of people think it's a power thing. You think that you can create power for yourself by taking power away from another person. And lots of there's lots of problematic, there's lots of this, and these are great questions, and I wish we could get to them.
I know. So next year we have to be back, and we have to make it at least an hour and a half. That we know for sure. It's 1:30. Judges need to go back to their workplace. So this is it for now, but we will be back next year. Thank you very much for participating in this panel, and thank you for the participants for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
you.
Jinna. Thank you, Dr. Gitu, Mia,
Yeah.
Rupert, Ed.
Yeah.